Question Lane. Solving problems through the process of questions and answers.
So today, would you suspect that most of the exports for these countries, are they doing business with other African countries, or are they mainly doing business with Europe?
Well, and of course, now it's more complicated than doing business with Europe. A lot of African countries trade heavily with China and India and the Middle East because they're big consumer markets for raw materials there. It is agricultural products are often sold to Europe, but services and things like that are now increasingly sold within the continent. Nigeria, for instance, the film industry in Nigeria, known as Nollywood, is, in terms of titles produced, the biggest film industry in the world, and most of it is direct to DVD. So doesn't go to theaters, but they produce huge numbers of DVDs, and those are sold all over the continent. So you could be in Congo, you could be in South Africa, you could be in Kenya, and if you go to a DVD store, you're going to be buying Nigerian sitcoms, dramas, soap operas, whatever. Music, again, a kind of a service industry type thing, is sold very much within the continent. Congo, soukous and music like that, produced in Congo. A lot of it is actually Congolese artists who work out of France, but that's sold all over Africa. So they're commoditized stuff, copper, coal, products like that tend to be, raw material type stuff tends to be exported either to China or to the West. Petroleum exported to all over the place. And not that much intra-African trade. But in some of these new sectors, there's actually a growing intra-African trade in those things. Right now, the biggest brewer on the continent, and in fact, I think the largest black-owned company in the world is SABC Miller, or SAB Miller, South Africa Breweries, which also owns Miller. And it produces beer all over the African continent. And then they sell products like Castle Lager, which is a SAB product, all over the continent. So much so that it's kind of driving out local beers. So there are intra-African trades that have developed since the colonial era. But the colonial era is very much built around sort of intra-imperial trade. So the British were very anxious to ensure that goods that were produced in Ghana or Nigeria went to Britain or somewhere else in the empire. So there was a certain amount of trade to and from India from East Africa because that was considered desirable trade within the British Empire. Okay,
so now I'm going to dive into your article here.
Okay.
How dual enrollment contributes to inequality. So one thing that I try to focus on here on the podcast is words and definitions so that myself and others are clear on what's being written and said. So the first word I want to focus on is inequality, which is in your title. What do you mean when you use the word inequality?
Well, that's actually a good question because I thought a lot about what I meant by dual enrollment, but less about what I mean by inequality. I think in that particular context, what we're talking about is inequality of opportunity. The sort of relative ease with which upper middle class, usually white, not in Arkansas, but in other places, probably Asian also, students are able to navigate the university system both financially and culturally compared to other groups, particularly minorities, who may not have the kind of cultural knowledge of how these things work, but also don't often have the financial means to make things work as easily or as effectively for themselves. So in this particular context, I think that's the type of inequality I'm talking about.
So would a maldistribution of resources for people who may be classified as not white, minority, etc., would that be, I guess, an accurate summation of what you're saying when you use the word inequality in this case?
Well, I think resources are part of it. but I think some of it is just kind of cultural knowledge and a sort of a structural function that isn't necessarily tied to resources. In the case of what we're talking about, some of it I think has to do with money. And I think the dual enrollment system was developed with very little thought and very little intentionality. I'm surprised actually at how little discussion of it there is, and how little thought has gone into it, because I think it's in a way has been more transformative of American higher education than online had. And whereas online and distance learning has gotten all kinds of attention, criticism, and things like that. And I think that's because there are ways to make money off of online education. There are businesses that make money off of it. Universities try to make money off of it. They usually lose their money to the businesses that are making money off of it. But with online, with dual enrollment, nobody's figured out how to make a buck off of it. And so I think it's kind of slipped under the radar. So I think whatever's going on with it, it's not part of some kind of complicated scheme to enhance inequality. I think it was probably intentioned to create opportunities for people who might not otherwise, to make it cheaper for people to go to college. But the sort of unintended consequence of this has been to make it cheaper for people for whom college was probably already reasonably affordable, and it hasn't done nearly as much to help people for whom college is a more difficult goal to reach.
In the article, you state that there's been a notable demographic shift from 5 years ago. You said that the students in your general education classes are disproportionately minorities, adults, and graduates of rural high schools. And you're teaching fewer middle and suburban white students as you have in the past. In your experience, do you think that these students are less prepared than the students that may have been in your classes in the past, or are you thinking that they're positioned to be in the correct position because there's more teacher interaction because of the small class size?
The small class size in my classes, or the small class size in high schools?
Well, no, small class sizes in your classes, since you said that there's not 40 students as they were in the past. They're just smaller and smaller numbers of students.
Yeah, unfortunately, and this is an idiosyncrasy of my own institution, and this may be very different in other places. We have this tendency, we've got all these classrooms that will accommodate about 40 to 50 students. And that is like the most inefficient size for a college class. It's not big enough to be efficient in terms of your numbers, and it's not really small enough to be intimate. Like a class of 15 students can be really different than a class of 40, but a class of 40 isn't that different from a class of 300. So we lose the efficiency of having these big lecture sections. So even though those classes are smaller, they tend to be about 35 or 30. And for a lot of the students, that's still they're not comfortable having a discussion in a class that big. So I don't know that anybody is gaining anything from a smaller, the kind of lower enrollment gen ed classes that they wouldn't have gotten when there were 40 or 45 students in those classes. I think what's the main thing, what drove my observation is I used to be really active in our honors program when I first got to Arkansas State. So 20 years ago, I was teaching honors classes that would have about 15 students in them. We met in a seminar room, so students would sit around a table, so they're all facing each other instead of me. And you could have a very good class where I lectured some, but we discussed. They talked to each other. I talked to them, and that was kind of rolling along pretty well. And I should point out that those classes, the sort of students who ended up in our honors program, were predominantly white suburbanites. Mostly, some of them drawn from our part of Northeast Arkansas, but a lot of them from the Little Rock suburbs. And then I went to work in the administration for 3 years and never thought much about concurrent enrollment because I was working on graduate school things and it just wasn't my world. And the next time I taught an honors class, after I left the graduate school, which was 3 years ago, I think, there were only 3 students in my class. And we've since stopped offering standalone world history honors classes. And I think the reason for that, this at a time when our honors college has doubled almost in size. But none of those students need to take world history anymore because they all took it in high school and got college credit for it. Meanwhile, in the non-honors classes, enrollments are down, but they're down, they're down in general. College enrollments are nationwide down right now. But I would say there's about a 10 or 15% drop in the overall size of my world history survey courses. And what's missing are the sort of non-honors student, white middle-class students who would have taken those courses 20 years ago, because they too, like the honors students, have taken all those classes in high school. So there's a kind of a different mix, both a slightly. I think the shrunken size is less significant than the change in the sort of mix of students in those classes. And some of the students in those classes are less well prepared than you would like them to be, but that's always been the case in a regional comprehensive university like ours, where we teach students with a really broad range of preparation, from people who probably were their socioeconomic situation not different, would have gone to Vanderbilt or something, to people who are really not ready to be in college. And so we've always had a complicated mix of students in our classes. But I think there's been and that's still true in the upper level classes, but the gen ed classes are increasingly, the better prepared, wealthier, and more suburban you are, the less likely you are to show up in a gen ed class anymore. Which I think is detrimental to everyone. I think it's detrimental to students who miss out on the experience of taking gen ed in college, because I do think there's a difference between taking a gen ed course in college from a college professor. I think it's detrimental to students who maybe are less well prepared and might have been sort of exposed to those stronger students in those classes. One of the kind of dirty secrets of higher education is that students learn more from each other than they do from their professors, or at least that's a significant part of it. And so the better prepared students kind of bring up the whole level of the class, and I think they benefit, their presence benefits everyone, and taking them out of the equation is detrimental to the whole process. And I think the other reason, the other sort of unfair aspect of this is that if you show up in college with 20 credits, 25 credits, 30 credits, I've seen people show up with as many as 36 credits, basically their whole freshman year done. College is only going to be 3 years for you, maybe 4. And so there are fewer potential disasters that are going to happen to you. Your car breaks down, you lose a job, you get a parent gets sick, or something like that might deflect you from your off your career or your college trajectory. By contrast, if you're in college for 6 years or 5 or 6 years, which is now the norm for how long it takes for most people to get a undergraduate degree, and you show up with almost no undergraduate credits, there's a lot more time for something to go wrong financially for you, something with your family, something with your health, that it's going to push you off your path. So I think it exposes some students to more risk of some sort of catastrophe that deflects them from their direction in college.
Thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed the content, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Stay up to date for more videos by clicking the bell notification icon and following our social media. For any of the people, groups, companies, or videos that were referenced in this video, don't forget to check the description and or the pinned comment section. The question lane, solving problems through the process of questions and answers.